challenge. So the most vulnerable people are receiving the least amount of climate finance. There's lots of different reasons why, and you'll hear some of those today, but hopefully this will just narrow your mind a little bit. And then maybe let's think about who is helping these people in the most fragile places. Again, this data came from the OECD 2019 data. And if you look at the top right, the most fragile and vulnerable, quite a lot of the money that's flowing into there is coming from the World Bank. And then there's little fragments of funding that's coming from multilaterals and a little bit from bilaterals. And then if we compare it to how much money is spent in other areas, the red lines are defense spending budgets, and the green line, the green part of the line, is adaptation finance. So again, hopefully that gives you a little bit of perspective as to how much money is really getting to these fragile places. At one point, we tried to look at how much money was flowing through Amazon in some of our richest countries, but that data was actually incredibly hard to find, to give you a bit of an idea. Okay, I'm going to stop there, but hopefully that's sharpened your mind as to some of the conversation that we're going to have in the next hour and a half. I'm going to ask our first speaker, Patrick Youssef, to come in and just give us a little bit of his thoughts as to what he's sensing and feeling from his own community and how he works in the humanitarian network. Patrick Youssef is the Director for Africa at ICRC, and he'll give us a few minutes of his thoughts. So over to you, Patrick. We're just having a time. Oh, Patrick's back. We're just having a few technical issues here. We're going to try and get Patrick back. Are you with us, Patrick? I think you need to switch your microphone and your camera on. We'll give you another couple of seconds, but if that doesn't work, we will move on. Let's just move on then, and hopefully we'll get Patrick back in later on in the session. I know he's an incredibly busy man, and he's dealing with some of our greatest crises in Ethiopia at the minute, so he was only going to join us for a little while. But let's pass over to Hans-Jörg Strohmeyer. Hans-Jörg, you're going to talk to us a little bit about what you're sensing from the situation on the ground. And I know that at OCHA you've got a huge amount of data and experience in your teams. And you're the Chief of Policy Development and Studies branch of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It'd be great for you just to give us your thoughts on the climate finance and humanitarian debate.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having this event. Already some of the slides were terrific, really in showing the imbalance in adaptation funding. And maybe I want to go further. I think if you look at, we're here at COP26, so many of the pavilions, so much of the discussion focuses around mitigation, carbon emissions and so on, which of course is important and life-saving, but it's life-saving and important in the global debate. What sort of gets overlooked is that while we're doing this, already tens of millions of people struggling for their life every single day. So one of the key messages that we're sending is the climate crisis is not only real and irreversible, it's now. It's already happening now. So we're doing a study which will come out in a few weeks' time that is entitled No Return to Normal. And the threat of climate change and the threat of a global runaway humanitarian crisis, because that's as real as it gets. So one of the messages that we're trying to send, climate change is a humanitarian crisis. It's also a human rights crisis. It's also a development crisis, and so on and so forth. But why is it a humanitarian crisis? Why is it important for us to understand that it is a humanitarian crisis already today? Let me just give you a few numbers. The top 15 countries from the Notre Dame Gain Index that are considered the most climate change vulnerable, not most hit by climate change events, but most vulnerable to climate change events. Out of those 15 countries, that's not a UN statistic, that's an external statistic, 12 have a humanitarian response plan, receive international humanitarian assistance. Now let me tell you that 4 or 5 of them have been receiving that assistance for more than 10 consecutive, for at least 10 consecutive years. 3 or 4 for at least 15, and several others for more than 20 years, humanitarian assistance. And as you can see, it's particularly droughts and floods that keep on getting more and more and more. So 2 contexts that we really have to focus on. President Obama earlier said, we're running out of time. And my spontaneous reaction was, well, we've already run out of time for millions and millions of people. They don't wait anymore what comes out of COP. They wait for what we do around adaptation for them. They want adaptation action to start, because that's not, this crisis is not happening in 2030. It's not waiting for us to decide these things, or for 2050, it's happening now. If you look at the projections, we're currently working on round about a 1.2 global warming increase, Celsius increase. We want to cap it. We're hoping to cap it at 1.5. So 1.2, we're already seeing all this proliferation of disasters anywhere. And if anything, if 2020 was the year that has shown us the potential of health pandemics to be apocalyptic, then 2021, I think, is the year that has shown the next global crisis, the climate crisis, has equal, if not bigger, potential to be apocalyptic. Anywhere in the world, we've seen floods, fires, inundation. So imagine, this is at 1.2 Celsius. 1.5 is what we're trying to cap. This would test the humanitarian system that we're all part of to its absolute limits. Our trajectory right now is 2.7. That's more than double what we're already seeing. 2.7 will lead to a breakdown, if not a collapse, of the systems at national, regional levels, but certainly of the international level. And so I think we need to take this, the figures that we have, much more seriously. And that's why mitigation is important, is essential. You have to do whatever you have to do to bring this down, to curb this. But at the same time, we need to put much more political attention, which then also translates into financial attention. If I looked at one of your charts, the World Bank is, if I understood correctly, one of the largest, if not the largest provider. That's good that the World Bank is doing this, but where are the big countries, the major carbon emitters that should be spearheading this effort? Not as compensation, but because it's the right thing to do. And so, again, going back to President Obama, it's not time is running out, time has run out. And if we don't do the right things right now, we will not even be able to use the intervening time to do the right thing. So what is the right thing in our view? What we're arguing is that humanitarian action very often is sort of considered, if mitigation fails, adaptation, development fails, we're the mopping up, the international mopping up brigade. That has to stop. Because if you look, particularly in fragile contexts, very often by default, we're the people who actually are there to stay 10, 15, 20 years. So if we want to be recipients of increased adaptation fund, adaptation attention, we also need to do a few things differently. 5 mindset shifts that I would like to propose here. The first one is we need to be much more anticipatory and earlier in investing in adaptation and community resilience. Community resilience, even in fragile contexts, is for me the anchor of what we should contribute towards. Not own it, not do it alone, not do it exclusively, but work towards strengthening communities to flatten the curve of that enormous increase in humanitarian need and vulnerability that is going to hit us. Secondly, we need to be more mindful of the protracted nature of many of these crises. Again, 10, 15, 20 years running humanitarian assistance. We need to have more consistency in our staying, in our funding, more flexibility in what we take from humanitarian and development funds, more types, the choice in programs, more livelihoods, more safety nets, more investment into at least basic essential service provision in some of these places, and multi-year commitments. We need to be, and that's very important, we need to be, and difficult for us as humanitarians, let's face it, in the realities, not that we don't think that way. We need to be much, much more integrated, multidisciplinary, disciplinary and complementary in our actions. A friend of mine said a few days ago, resilience, remember community resilience as the goal, resilience is an integrated concept. It requires integrated solutions. There is no singular solution that Mercy Corps can provide, that OCHA can provide, that WFP can provide, or anyone else. We need to work together. plan together, analyze together, have common understandings of the priority, and work with local communities and local governments to achieve them towards shared visions and objectives of what we want to achieve, priorities. Fourthly, we need to be more inclusive, as I just mentioned, in our ways. And inclusive is not political correctness. In this case, it's the very essence of what we're trying to achieve. Inclusive with local governments, with local communities. It is about their resilience, about their survival, but also about their agency, about their capacity that they bring. The only chance at current trajectories to actually hope that this curve of need at a constantly widening gap between income and what we're able to do against those needs, to flatten that need, that needs curve, that increase a little bit over the next years. The fifth point is that we need to be much more skilled as translators translators into local communities, towards local governments, of the science, the research, the understandings that we have. A mayor in the Philippines told me a few weeks ago, look, in my community, people are fishermen and farmers. Both of the communities over the last 5 to 10 years have consistently lost income, livelihoods, and so on. But very, very few of them have related that to climate change, to those changes. And that makes it very difficult for local communities and authorities, institutions to actually create the right capacities, to take the right policy decisions. So we need to contribute to that understanding at the local level. At the same time, take what people have as priorities, as solutions, as knowledge about the context with us to integrate into our work. So, long story short, I think the time is now. It is far more serious in this adaptation bracket than we sort of speak about when you look at what's already happening. I think we need to be understood as part of the adaptation solution as humanitarians, because that's how we work every day. But we also need to do something to adapt ourselves to be more effective, particularly towards creating community resilience. 3 final propositions that I would like to make in terms of gaps. One big gap is around knowledge, research, data, and so on. If you look at modeling around emissions and so on, you have relatively good and accurate data sets. The nexus between these types of risks and actual impacts, vulnerability, and how this translates into need in an environment that has compounded effects and risk factors, other global challenges you feed into and you feed off again into climate change. Climate change very rarely is the single driver of need, but there is a whole ocean. It's a big blank site. We need to invest much more scientific, not policy research, scientific research, multi-year modeling, and so on. And I think this is an area that will help some of those trends that you showed on your adaptation financing. The second part is we need to think much more about if we were to get more of this financing, if your curves and slides were to turn around, how would we then ensure, through what mechanisms, that additional money actually goes to affected communities? I was just at a stand where a government official from Nepal spoke, and they said, we make sure that the external money only to a very small extent gets spent at national levels. 85% need to go to adaptation plans, framework plans that are per municipality. Every municipality has their own framework plan that the government gives them, but fill it in by priorities. That's what we have to think. How do we get the money actually to communities in fragile contexts? And the last point is, we've been talking about preparedness, rebalancing preparedness and response. And I think I don't really like that term so much. If understood correctly, of course, it expresses where we need to go. But I don't think it can be about give us less money for response, because the needs are going to grow and we need that money. Already we have a big gap. There will be more emergency needs. But what we have to do, we need investments, serious investments, in preparedness, and not everyone with their own preparedness mechanism. We need to integrate preparedness. We need to be far more strategic and politically aware around what priorities we create, what type of preparedness measures and capacities, again, with partners. So in closing, the time is now. I think the figures are serious. And I close with two final figures just to make that point of now again. 83% rise in recorded disasters over the last 20 years. 83%, and the number of people affected by it have risen as well astronomically. So climate change is not a hoax; it's real, and it's very real, and a challenge for now in many of those contexts around the world that we unfortunately don't see every day in the global media. Thank you.
Thanks, Hans-Jörg. And it's great to hear some of the stories from the front lines, basically, because these data can sometimes become quite clinical and people don't realize that there are lives and people and vulnerabilities behind that. So thank you. I'm not sure if we've managed to get Patrick back on the line. Shall we see? We'll give him a wee second. Okay, so we might not hear from Patrick, apologies. We're going to move on then, and I'm going to introduce you to Tilly. Tilly is the Director of Research at Future Proof Ideas and a Senior Research Consultant at the Red Cross Climate Centre. And some of that scientific research that Hans-Jörg's just been mentioning, Tilly's been heavily involved in that in a couple of very significant reports in the last few years. So Tilly, could you tell us more about where you found some of the finance to be flowing and some of the challenges around that?
Absolutely, thanks Lizzie, and it's really an honour to be on this panel with you guys. First, good evening, good afternoon and good morning to everyone joining. In preparing for this talk, I've been looking a lot at recent report titles from the international community: Money Where It Matters, The Cost of Doing Nothing, At What Cost, A Code Red for Humanity, A World of Climate Promises Not Yet Delivered. The chorus highlighting the insufficient investments to back adaptation efforts is strong and has been growing year by year. And it is a call that started with frontline communities. Time and time again, they have been sounding the alarm on the drastic changes needed in the global economy, in funding, in the humanitarian and development systems. And with my time today, I want to contribute three main findings from research that I've been conducting on adaptation and finance to support this call for increased financial ambition and action. First, a global perspective, looking at which countries have been targeted or not, as might be the case. Second, a context-specific perspective focused on areas in which the climate crisis and conflict collide. And third, a sector-specific perspective, that of health. So location, context, sector. Are those in charge of the money targeting fairly, ensuring sensitivity, and investing enough in critical activities when it comes to climate adaptation finance? First, I also want to stress that drastically reducing emissions, cutting excessive consumption, and keeping oil in the ground is absolutely fundamental in preventing further warming. But as we've heard, 1.1 or 1.2 of warming has already been locked in, and it is due to the historic emissions of the rich, industrialized, polluting countries. The destabilized climate and increasing frequency of extreme weather is affecting those that had little to do with the crisis, the first and the hardest. Over a decade ago, the People's Agreement drawn together in Cochabamba, Bolivia, for the World People's Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth stated, developed countries as the main cause of climate change, in assuming their historical responsibility, must recognize and honor their climate debt in all of its dimensions as the basis for a just, effective, and scientific solution to climate change by providing the means to prevent, minimize, and deal with damages arising from their excessive emissions. This statement highlighted the adaptation debt that wealthy countries owe frontline communities for the climate change impacts disproportionately affecting frontline communities because of the pollution and emissions caused by wealthy countries. So wealthy countries, has the adaptation financing available to date targeted countries that are being disproportionately affected? This was the central question of a study for the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, and the short answer is no. There is no correlation between the amount of money received for climate change adaptation and the climate vulnerability of a given country. Along the x-axis of the figure is the climate vulnerabilities of countries from the ND Gain Index. And the y-axis is the amount of climate adaptation finance received per capita of the population living in extreme poverty. The horizontal line shows no correlation between these two variables. While you would expect more money to be channeled to more climate vulnerable countries, in fact, climate adaptation funds are not being targeted according to need, and money is not going to the countries and people that need it the most. So why might money not be going to certain climate vulnerable countries? What is it about these contexts that might be influencing access to finance or willingness from donors to provide money? Well, many climate vulnerable countries are also countries that are experiencing fragility and conflict. And while not directly causing conflict, climate impacts can exacerbate issues that drive conflict, such as land degradation, food insecurity, and migration. And conflict in turn can amplify the impacts of climate change by increasing communities' and institutions' exposure and vulnerability to climate-related hazards and lowering their capacity to adapt. Research I was involved in for the FCDO-funded SPARK program found that despite their high vulnerability, many countries in the Sahel and Horn of Africa receive less adaptation funding than average for least developed countries. Donors tend to favor safer places. The more fragile a country is, the less adaptation finance it received. These series of maps of Mali, one of the case study contexts in that report, highlights this. In the top left corner, you see the climate vulnerability of Mali, concentrated towards the north and east of the country. Below that, you see the violent events concentrated around the border and central Mali. And then the biggest map, you finally see the climate adaptation projects that are concentrated in the south, largely away from the conflict and in areas where the climate vulnerability is relatively lower than elsewhere. I must highlight here that climate finance is not intended to directly address the complex dynamics of insecurity or conflict, and that programs may not target areas in active conflict because the security risks are too high for the operational and financial risk appetites of donors. But when investments either, one, avoid armed conflict areas, or two, are not sufficiently conflict sensitive in a given conflict area, then the result is highly vulnerable populations are not being reached effectively by adaptation projects. So far, I've shown that in terms of location, targeting is not equitable, and I've shown that in terms of context, specifically with the climate crisis and conflict collide, many groups of people are not being reached by adaptation finance. Finally, what about a specific sector? What about adaptation finance flows towards the health sector? We know that there is a significant overlap between populations serviced by humanitarian actors and those most vulnerable to the health effects of climate change. And we also know that whilst many countries recognize the impact of climate change on health, this doesn't always translate to funding allocations, and that the most affected people and areas are also some of the least able to finance the actions to address the health impacts of climate change. When it comes to adaptation financing for health, the stark picture I've been painting so far does not look much better. The WHO recently estimated that less than 0.5% of multilateral climate finance targets health. At the Red Cross Climate Centre, I've been involved in a study that is looking at finances towards health and found that since 2010, only 27 out of nearly 900 principally labelled adaptation projects funded by multilaterals were directly focused on health. For bilateral funding, only 127 out of nearly 39,000 principally labelled adaptation projects were tagged as specifically health-related. We estimated that only around 0.37% of climate adaptation funding, both multilateral and bilateral combined, is channeled directly to health activities. This is certainly not the full picture yet, and we have several further analyses to run, but it is an indication of the low number of projects and amount of funding for health so far. Location, context, sector. There is substantial room for improvement on decisions on where, how, and on what climate adaptation finance should be spent to support frontline communities in being able to take the action that is needed. I wish that the saying, "a problem well stated is a problem half solved," were true, yet people from the most affected areas have been speaking truth to power for decades. And what have we seen? Decades of insufficient action. Now we are left with only one decisive decade needing radical action. This needs to be a moment of acceleration. The longer adaptation and risk reduction efforts are put off by chronic underfunding, the more difficult and expensive it will be to manage adaptation needs, and the harder it will be to save lives and mitigate suffering. Well-placed finance is instrumental in keeping us below 1.5 degrees C and support those already forced to adapt to the 1.1 that is locked in. So I'm going to take the final few minutes to share some overall recommendations. First, donors need to question adaptation funding strategies which, one, are not pro-poor, and two, are not prioritizing countries where the impacts of the climate crisis are and will be most severe. Second, much more new and additional, well above the estimates of 10% of funding, needs to be channeled to local actors, particularly in fragile and conflict-affected states. Third, financing mechanisms need to be reformed to strengthen the decision-making power of affected people, particularly marginalized groups. They should aim to strengthen local structures, processes, and institutions, working with civil society actors and within existing networks. And fourth, donors need to improve their coordination on where to operate. A starting point could be a systematic mapping of adaptation programs within a country, identifying areas where multiple actors are operating and should be working synergistically, and areas where there is limited investment and presence needing greater attention. It is not too late. These are just some of the many suggestions on what could be done to scale up financial flows to the front line. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Tilly. It's not too late, and Patrick has arrived. I can see you on the screen, Patrick. Welcome. We're going to pass over to you for some remarks. And Patrick is the Director for Africa at the International Committee for the Red Cross. And I'm sure you've got some interesting anecdotes and stories around climate finance and humanitarians and what you're sensing and feeling in your role. So over to you, Patrick. Thank you.
First, big apology. Technical problems unfortunately hindered my participation from the beginning, so apologies for that. And again, thanks for giving me the floor. I'm very pleased and honored to be sharing some remarks on, simply put, our experience as the Red Cross movement, but also from the ICRC on the role of humanitarians in responding again to the climate crisis. I guess the initial question that was asked is, what are we seeing as a sector, and how are we changing our work? You know, I'm a Red Cross staff, and I see in my role that humanitarians are increasingly seeing that the communities with whom they work are on the front lines of the climate crisis. And here, from the International Committee of the Red Cross experience, I see this work with communities affected by armed conflicts and violence around the world, where is increasingly taking a larger space in their lives as opposed to when I started with the ICRC in 2005 in Darfur, where, again, there was not much attention around these specificities that unfortunately not only degrade the climate, but also the environment in which people live. As many of you know, some 60% of the 25 countries considered the most vulnerable for climate hazards are also and least ready to cope with climate changes, are affected by wars and violence. And the capacity of the communities, but also the people to adapt and act and take concrete actions is certainly compromised, not only by the lack of their economic power, weaker institutions, no social cohesion, because that is the first thing destroyed and shrapneled by wars and violence, but also these also put at risk much of the development holds or gains that development actors try and put in their contexts. So the question for me is, how are we adapting our work to make sure we are providing the kind of support needed, that people need, but that also we show some sensitivity towards this international crisis, this global crisis? We know that it's not just the ICRC, but all the humanitarian sector has noticed these changes, and that the sector as a whole is looking into adaptive work. We've seen this shift since at least 5 to 6 years in how humanitarians have approached climate change over the past few years. So together with Red Cross and Red Crescent partners, we have been working to galvanize and steer humanitarian action in the face of these crises. For example, I was recently in the DRC after the big volcano eruption. I was last week in Ethiopia. Our Director General was in Mali recently, and he saw indeed the impact of trying and making sure we adapt our operations. So, for example, in the Sahel, we helped farmers and herders cope with the desertification, or with rainfall variability or water scarcity by simply rehabilitating irrigation schemes, stabilizing advancing dunes, and supporting the storage of production for animal feed. As many of you are aware, the Climate and Environment Charter for humanitarian actors is a testament for the collective willingness to step up and do our part, and thus far 170 organizations around the world have signed the charter. This is a sign of seriousness and an engagement for us not to make things worse, but simply to listen, to put people at the center and listen to what they are telling us. So we've been collaborating not only with communities, but also with development actors such as the African Development Bank, l'Agence Française de Développement, but also with the private sector, researchers, to call for a collective and stronger and holistic climate action in fragile settings. Now, I think what we need to brainstorm is about our ways to unlock climate financing for communities who basically need it the most. And here, climate action and finance are particularly weak, unfortunately, in the countries that I just mentioned, and many others like in Somalia or now in the north of Ethiopia, enduring conflict because of the challenges attached to implementing long-term plans in the middle of conflict settings. But these are the places that are mostly needed for such an action. And here we need to come together to address the significant disparities between the provision of climate financing to stable middle-income countries and those with fragilities, those who receive basically minor fractions of the funding where the vulnerability is the highest. And we always say, for us to be contributors to solving problems, we need to look at the root causes of these crises in order to leapfrog and make sure we do connect with the basis of the problems and try to solve them. And again, that's not happening in the places that we operate in. And here I think we also need to reflect on the past pandemic and use basically the same motto as we collectively said: no one is safe until everyone is safe. So I'm trying to think of a conclusion here, and in saying that, the price of these imbalances and obstacles, but essentially the cost of inaction, is extremely high and irreversible. That also applies to, by the way, to the whole narrative of vaccination equity. And it goes in the same line as saving lives and making sure climate financing reaches where it needs to get. So as a result, the humanitarian consequences of climate shocks are likely to be greater and forcing larger humanitarian responses if we don't take these issues seriously and approach in an advocacy space more and more those actors who need to be attentive to, unfortunately, the fragilities that we see in front of us. The Red Cross, the Red Crescent volunteers, and all other humanitarian actors are also living the same reality. So again, collectively and jointly, we can achieve much better results in order to make sure that equity in addressing these fragilities is indeed attained to all those who are suffering. Back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and thanks for joining us. I know you're incredibly busy at the moment. For those that are joining through the COP platform, do remember that there is a question section. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask the panel, do feel free to put them into the platform. I'm going to now pass over to Jill Deberg, who is the President of Trinidad and Tobago Red Cross. Welcome, Jill. Thank you for joining us. It'd be great if you could tell us more about how you feel your national and local needs are being met or not by climate finance.
Good evening, distinguished panelists and participants. It's my pleasure to speak to you all at this critical conference. And I'd like to thank our co-organizers, the International Federation of the Red Cross, International Committee of the Red Cross, and Mercy Corps for convening this discussion. By now, we are all aware that we, as a global collective, are on a crash course to exceed the 1.5 target within the coming decade, the consequence of which will be especially detrimental to small island developing states. The science tells us that we are currently at around 1.2 above pre-industrial levels, and the consequences are already being felt in countries in the Caribbean, including Trinidad and Tobago. In Trinidad and Tobago, It is estimated that 23% of the country is vulnerable to severe flooding. And our National Climate Change Vulnerability and Capacity Assessment, conducted in 2019, has identified flooding as the second most priority hazard, following earthquakes. Flash flooding is not only a function of infrastructure, but also the intensity of rainfall, which has increased due to climate change. Earlier this year in August, Trinidad and Tobago experienced sudden and intense rainfall at rates exceeding 100 millimeters per hour. Within 45 minutes, we had experienced more than a month's worth of rain. This led to the bursting of riverbanks and flash flooding, which destroyed homes, killed pets, and swept away vehicles throughout the capital city, Port-of-Spain. The damage was so sudden and severe that government's catastrophe insurance paid out US $2.4 million to support recovery. Most concerning is that this is just the latest occurrence in a growing trend of anomalous rainfall. We have had 3 similar events in the past 4 years, 2017, 2018, and 2019. The 2018 event remains the most scarring, resulting in US $3.7 million in damage and adversely affecting over 150,000 citizens. But the anomalies do not stop there. In the last 2 years, we have seen extremes in the microclimate variation, with the southern half of Trinidad experiencing blistering heat recorded at 40 Celsius on the urban heat index, while simultaneously the north experiencing thunderstorm with hail. Can you imagine a hailstorm on a tropical island? It has happened twice in 2021. These changes in temperature and extreme rainfall has also created favorable conditions for the breeding and migration of the Moruga grasshopper, locally known as locusts. According to our Ministry of Agriculture, locust swarms, which once occurred every 14 years, are now an annual occurrence. Right now, as I speak, these locusts are devastating agricultural lands and encroaching into urban environments. Believe me when I say that the need for anticipatory action is greater than it has ever been. All these things happen as an added layer above an already constrained national economy, struggling to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, as most are. There's rising food insecurity, job insecurity, and at times even home insecurity. What those of us working on the ground know with certainty, and as expressed in the Climate and Environment Chapter, we are in a climate crisis, and it is already impacting the lives of our most vulnerable communities, from their economic livelihoods and food security, psychosocial well-being, access to clean drinking water, and much more. Trinidad and Tobago Red Cross is a signatory to the Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations. And we are resolute in the 7 commitments, which represents our clear express commitment to impactful and sustainable programming activities towards the realization of behavioral change in our society as it relates to climate change. How are we turning this commitment into action? By devising an ambitious 5-year environmental program that builds on the legacy and partnership of our crisis management, youth and health services. Aptly named Safeguarding Society Through Environmental Sustainability, it recognizes that humanitarian crises can be catalyzed by natural disaster and intensified by existing environmental conditions. Our 5-year program is built on a foundation of technical assessment and stakeholder engagement. It establishes 4 pillars of work to make the Trinidad and Tobago Red Cross an exemplar in environmental leadership and a driving force in building national environmental sustainability and social resilience. Our 4 pillars are energy and climate mitigation, community-based climate change risk reduction, adaptation and resilience, environmental education, ecosystem-based livelihoods, and community empowerment. 4th, sustainable circular economy. Across these 4 pillars, there are 61 activities that we anticipate will yield 100,000 beneficiaries, establishing over 30 new partnerships. As the Charter calls for us to develop targets and measure progress, there are 145 key performance indicators built in to keep the program on track as we hope to both mitigate the Trinidad and Tobago Red Cross carbon print while building the capacity of the most vulnerable communities. Our activities also bring to life the Charter's commitment to maximize the sustainability of our work and rapidly reduce GHG emissions. Activities such as conducting more frequent EVCAs across both Trinidad and Tobago using our decentralized office model sets a bolder ambition for a customary community-based approach. Other activities such as making our facilities carbon neutral by 2025 are new to us and a work in progress. I am proud to say that earlier this year, the Trinidad and Tobago Red Cross Port of Spain office was identified as one of the 12 sites to have solar photovoltaic solar panels installed under the EU Global Climate Change Alliance Plus project, support to the implementation of Trinidad and Tobago's nationally determined contribution. We will mobilize our human resource and experience of working on the ground to activate community-led reforestation, returning tree cover to land destabilized by urban development and agricultural slash and burn practices, both of which further exacerbate the frequency of localized flooding. Initially, this will include the planting of over 1,000 trees by communities, volunteers, staff, and youth champions, and will be aligned to long-term behavior change education through community-based training on preservation of the green environment and practical demand-side management techniques for reducing energy consumption. Our Garden to Kitchen initiative to support individual and community food security brought into sharper focus by the COVID-19 pandemic and erratic weather patterns is expanding further into a farm-to-shelf initiative, a trading farm and farmers market that encourages a communal return to the land on a larger scale. Young people will continue to be an important component of our work to speed up change. Having contributed to the development of our environmental program as stakeholders, we will continue the engagement through our Youth Links and Trailblazers program at primary and secondary schools. This will include providing interactive and experiential learning materials and training for both students and teachers on renewable energy, energy efficiency, low emissions practices, and lifestyles as part of our behavior change strategy to foster a more environmentally responsible citizenry and green advocates. So, are national and local needs being met? It's a work in progress. We are doing the best we can with what we have and have been successful with thus far. However, as national and local vulnerability, and by extension need increases, the TTRCS will require more to fulfill our humanitarian mission. Our aim is to shift the TTRCS from being an organization that is reactive to environmental hazards to one that is proactive in adapting, building resilience, reducing climate change, and protecting livelihoods. By leveraging our strengths as a lightning rod for volunteerism, local and community-based action, and institutional partnerships, we will position ourselves as an exemplar on how the third sector can drive climate change action and environmental sustainability. It is an ambitious program, however, it is one we will proudly champion. The complete rollout of our climate and environmental program is expected to cost US $1.2 million over the next 5 years, a nominal amount compared to the cost of inaction or avoidance. Climate finance is a critical topic at this year's COP. We wait with bated breath for details on how Article 9 of the Paris Agreement will be realized, how US $100 billion per year will be transferred from developed countries to developing countries in dire need of adaptation financing to the tune of 50% for adaptation. especially for small island development states. The resolution of this issue will help us tremendously in meeting local needs and scaling up our adaptation and anticipatory action initiatives. Notwithstanding, the Trinidad and Tobago Red Cross will keep its heads above water, literally and figuratively, as we live the ethos, people-focused, mission-based, and community-driven. Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. And it's great to hear you putting the Charter into action and taking that bold ambition. I'm sure you can inspire others. Like Mercy Corps, we've just signed up a few weeks ago, so we need to start and follow in your good footsteps. So thank you, Jill. And I'm going to pass on to our last speaker now. Tiziana Bonzon is the Manager for Climate, Migration and Resilience at the International Federation of the Red Cross. Thank you, Tiziana, for joining us. It'd be great if you could give us some of your thoughts on what does climate finance mean for humanitarians, how do they understand it, and what's your advice for us here at COP?
Thank you so much, Lizzie. And again, wanted to also say how pleased I am to be part of this panel. And maybe a challenge when coming last is that what I'm going to say has already been said by somebody else. So I'm going to, of course, re-emphasize some of the points that we heard from the other speakers. But maybe just to say that we're not saying it enough. The climate crisis is indeed a humanitarian crisis and a humanitarian issue. And this is why we're here to talk about this subject. We are seeing increasing humanitarian caseload. Today, we heard some of the figures also from the OCHA speaker at the beginning of the panel. Over the past 10 years, some 1.7 billion people have been impacted by extreme weather and climate-related disasters. This is very much the reality on the ground of the communities that we are supporting. Climate risk is impacting people's lives and livelihoods around the world, and we know that those most affected are the poorest, the most marginalized, and those whose capacity to adapt is actually the weaker. So I think these are really important points that we have to keep reminding and repeating. Humanitarians are at the front lines. We are playing a little bit the fire brigades here because it's just keep coming back. We are right there with the communities. Individuals are affected on a daily basis. We know that urgent action is needed to not only halt the ongoing warming of a planet, but already to address and respond to the humanitarian impacts, empowering very much local actors, local stakeholders to lead themselves in adapting to a changing climate and to also access climate finance. And we'll see as I keep going, some of the barriers and the challenges that exist for local actors in particular, for those on the ground to access climate finance. Maybe just to say that as humanitarians, and we heard it also from the colleague from ICRC, we really want to play a role and collaborate with partners at all levels to show that we want to make sure that our work contributes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also very much to show that we can contribute with other partners in the development work, in the development sector, humanitarian, scientific sector to scale up adaptation. And what does that actually mean? So it was mentioned the Charter, and I think it's an important piece, and I'd like to just go back to that because it is an amazing commitment that the humanitarian sector is taking to show that we have a role to play, but also that we want to make our voice much stronger, and we want to show that we can indeed contribute to scaling up adaptation, to empowering more local actors, to enhance collaboration, to become more anticipatory, but also at the same time to look at what we don't do well and set targets for ourselves. And we heard also from Jill how much this is actually being turned into practice already. So we are very pleased that the Charter, which was a process, we call it together with the ICRC in an advisory council that brought together a number of very important partners from the environmental, development and humanitarian sectors. And we're seeing that more than 170 organizations have already endorsed and adopted the Charter. So it's an important testimony of where we want to go and the contribution we want to make. So indeed, scaling up adaptation requires a collective effort. So it's not just the task of humanitarians. And I believe that here in Glasgow, we really need to highlight the importance of what is a locally led adaptation and resilience. We actually heard it already from the UN Secretary General at the beginning of this COP. Adaptation works. Early warning saves lives. Climate smart agriculture saves jobs. I mean, this is proven. So we have to do much more of that. However, we know that the money is not always going where it needs to go. We've seen it in some of the slides. The many highly vulnerable countries are left behind. They receive little funding for climate action, and actually very little funding goes to the local communities and the frontline communities that are the ones who need it the most. Why is this so? On one hand, we know that one of the reasons is that most of the money is going to mitigation. So we have to redress the balance here. We need to really advocate for much stronger investments into adaptation. But there is also something else. You know, one of the other reasons that there are obstacles, barriers, and challenges that are often preventing vulnerable countries from accessing the much needed climate finance. You have countries that are less finance ready to absorb some of this funding, so they've been set aside, or sort of the poorest or the most weakly governed countries, they find themselves unable to navigate these funding opportunities, to meet and comply with some of the requirements, the accountability that is expected from them. So there is a responsibility here from the entire community to actually build the capacities and to make sure that the funds are indeed used for the purposes that they are allocated for, but taking the courage to actually go when it is hard and when it is most difficult, and not leaving people behind. So we need to, of course, support countries that do not have the preconditions needed, such as basic accountability systems and infrastructures to adapt and not to miss out. And we also need to support their absorption capacities, because indeed the funding that we are after is for the longer term. And usually, especially through the humanitarians, we are confronted with short-term cycles of humanitarian funding. And we're used to that. When we talk about climate adaptation, we have to think much more longer term. So there's a dramatic shift that is needed here to increase the amount of finance that flows to frontline communities, to have them prepare for and adapt to rising risks, even when it is difficult to do so. Another very important point is the role of local actors. We heard it already, but this is so essential, because it is local actors, communities themselves, being really people-centered in whatever we want to promote. Because it is people themselves that are already confronted with the consequences of climate change. They're already taking measures, they're not waiting for us. You know, they test, they try new solutions, they look at changing their crops, they look at how they can protect their own communities. And so there is indeed much more that we can do to leverage the traditional knowledge and the local wisdom and match this with the climate science. You know, often when we go to communities, people know what happened yesterday, what happened 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but they may not really realize, okay, but what's going to happen tomorrow? And this is where we really bring the two worlds together. You know, what is climate science saying? But also using this traditional knowledge and this wisdom that the local communities can bring to influence the right decisions and solutions, to influence the national plans, and making sure that that voice is truly heard. Now, national Red Cross and Crescent societies are incredible players in their own communities. They have this amazing auxiliary role where they can liaise with national governments, local governments, and bring the voice of the communities to make sure that their needs, their solutions are taken into account in national plans, national adaptation plans, and in whatever solutions governments may wish to come up with. Otherwise, they will not be sustainable. National Red Cross and Crescent societies are part of any sustainability strategy for the governments themselves, but also for any other partners who wish to invest in this area. You know, local actors, because they're there, they're not going to go away. They're there before, during, and after. And so they're a key element of this sustainability strategy. Another element I'd like to mention is the importance of leaving no one behind. Unless we're truly inclusive, and we heard it, but this is so true. Unless we're truly inclusive, we're going to fail. You know, we really need to take into account the needs of those who are living in slums, the migrants, the displaced, the women, the young people, the minorities, the indigenous communities. All of them are part of the solution. And this is why leaving no one behind means adopting measures, designing interventions, where they're all part of the decision that is being taken. So maybe just to say, with the IFRC, with our network of Red Cross and Crescent National Societies, we're fully committed to supporting the communities today and tomorrow. We're doing this through integration. We heard this word before, integrating climate risk management across all of our programs and operations. This means understanding the climate risk and enhancing this understanding across all of our members, so that this can truly be integrated in sector intervention, when you're building latrines and when you're looking at livelihoods intervention. In communities, they need to be accompanied in that process, but they also need to be on the driving seat, but be supported with this climate science and analysis in whatever, whatever needs to be done. Another interesting element that came up is the need to be much more anticipatory. Of course, very much part of that. Anticipatory finance models is something that we are scaling up. We've been pioneering, and we know it works, but it needs to be people-centered. This is not just about systems. It's about people being able to take action on warnings, but also, again, using forecasting, using finance. So say here again, we're talking about bringing many different actors together. I think I'm going to stop here. Just wanted to say that we would like to inspire others to do the same. We see really the value in all of us coming together as a humanitarian community around this issue, and continue to support each other to progress on our ambitions, and we're calling on others to rise to the challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiziana. There's a huge amount of wisdom in what you've just shared. And from what I'm hearing from all of our fellow panel members around funding and climate finance, I think we're all asking for the right volumes of climate finance to reach adaptation, so trying to get that balance right between mitigation and adaptation, but also to note that it should be new money. It shouldn't be money that comes out of existing ODA budgets. If we steal money from ODA budgets and use it to make great announcements on climate finance, we're just increasing the humanitarian burden, because that is going to hit the hardest and the most vulnerable. We need funding to be more agile. We need longer term and predictable funding models. There was a lot of conversation today about locally led decision making, trying to get the money as local as possible. And a lot of us have signed up to the principles for locally led adaptation, and it's worth checking those out if you don't know them already. And maybe one of the most important things is trying to understand how we can get climate finance for adaptation to those in fragile places who need it most, where it's most difficult to operate. So I think, Tilly, you'd said that donors tend to fund in places that are safer. And even within fragile countries, we can see that pattern where they're going to the places where it's possible. So maybe as humanitarians, our role is to try and show them alternatives and show what can be possible. And maybe our role as humanitarians is to be a facilitator of that conversation, but also a translator. So Hans-Jörg was talking about having to try and explain that some of the impacts that communities are experiencing, trying to help them understand that it is about climate change, but also trying to take that information to donors and show them that there are options in very fragile places, and that humanitarians have got a role to play in this. Are there any questions from anybody that's joining online? I can see someone on the screen. Does someone want to come in and ask a question? Maybe not. Maybe they'll come back. But you're very welcome to ask a question. Be brave. We're very friendly. And also maybe just to link it back to the UK presidency here in COP. They released the Glasgow Imperative a few days ago. Again, it's worth having a look at this if you haven't already seen it. And these are themes and pillars that they hope to really deepen action and attention to over the course of this year, and also hopefully try and tease that into the African COP next year. Those 5 pillars are about building resilience across all of society, building effective risk management, transforming finance, catalysing locally led action, and harnessing the power of nature. And quite a lot of that has come up in the conversations that we've had today. With just about 10 minutes left in our session, I'm just going to go around our panel and ask a pretty obvious question. But imagine you can break through the magic doors here at COP and go and speak to the negotiators who are working incredibly hard and must be exhausted mid-week 2 of COP. If you could grab one of them and take them out for a coffee, what would you tell them as a humanitarian? What would your one point be to try and convince them that there's action here and that we're part of the solution. I'm going to go to you first, Hans-Jörg. What would you tell that?
I've had the longest time.
Yeah, what would you tell that negotiator?
Thank you. I mean, I think it would be around this point of adaptation, you know. I mean, a lot has been discussed about Glasgow being a turning point and whether it's going to be that turning point for 1.5 or on a lot of these mitigation things. Who knows? I think there's a lot of serious effort and so on. But for sure, if we want to be ready for 2028, the next one, Glasgow needs to be a turning point on adaptation, on taking the now and what's happening right now in front of us much, much more seriously. So, and a lot of the things that we said about the very real barriers and challenges to get money to local communities. But one thing that struck me, for example, about some of the maps that you had in Mali, I don't think it's as easy as saying the donors take the safer way out. We take the safer way too. There is how much programming for those in those areas, for those most affected communities by us, is actually happening. And I do think that some donors get what we're saying, and there are parts of those donors that are willing to go, maybe not the full, whatever, how many miles, but to be a bit more daring, to have a bit more. But they're looking at the options. So what options do we have in those really most in the deep field, most affected, fragile, sometimes sort of on the margin of conflict, affected, one day, not really. What options realistically do they have? Bilaterally, very rarely. Already, it was lower than the multilateral. The risk financing and external investments, likely not in those areas, from insurances and so on. So very often in those communities, it is the multilateral, and all of us are part of this, the multilateral trajectory that is the way of how to get more funding much closer to those communities. But that cannot just be sort of handed over to the donors. And I'm not trying to make the case now for the donors, but that must start with us. They're looking at us to lead the way. And so we need to also look at our way of programming and say, how can we move more beyond what we're saying here and recognizing here into our daily practice, as Patrick and you and others said, of going to those places where it hurts and not also play it safe. I'm probably being unfair to many, many people who are risking their lives right now, but you know what I mean. I don't think that we're always the ones who are in those places and then asking for those places. And if we don't do that, we're not making a convincing case. Maybe if you allow me just one additional point. As much as I 150% agree with that focus on the most vulnerable and those left behind. But what I found really interesting when you look at the trajectory and where it's going to go, let's also not just get stuck in what we see today. But there will be many hotspots, and that's, if you look at that apocalyptic increase that would come at 2.73% and more, that's going to happen in new hotspots. And I was very intrigued when we spoke to, we heard our colleague from Trinidad and Tobago. You look at the SIDS, you look at the Caribbean, there is, in addition to being hit by these disasters, and almost the cycle right now is that many of these countries never get into a recovery mode. They never get out of the cleanup mode and remain in that constant cleanup, crisis management loop. So how much time is there to step aside and to actually do all these things that we're asking them to do at the same time as they accrue a mega debt, which actually gets them much closer to that cliff. So what I urge us to do is not just look at, in this adaptation financing, at those most vulnerable, but how can we work, which is of course politically also sensitive, with some of those countries where we can already project there is going to, remember, floods and droughts. There is no escape. Climate change is irreversible. It's not going to miraculously change in 2 years or 15 years, even if we're successful in Glasgow and beyond. So if you look at projections towards 2030 and 2050, you can see which places are even more hit by extreme weather events and floods, even more drought, more permanently. So let's work with those contexts, those new hotspots. We've had a few weeks ago, I was really struck by that, because of drought in Central America, for the first time since the 1980s, sort of, or early 90s, a briefing again, a humanitarian briefing on, not that there is a humanitarian response plan or anything yet, or a consolidated international effort, but we're refocusing on countries that we thought we had long left behind. If I had told anyone 15 years ago, we're going to be for a long time in the Philippines, people have said, why are we in the Philippines? You know, that's a reality right now. So let's also look at those new hotspots. Someone, I think maybe Patrick said it, those middle and lower middle income countries right now that are struggling, accruing more and more debt, that's also a focus that we need to apply at the same time. So we humanitarians need to, in this translation function that we all mentioned, we need to be able to handle 2 or 3 tricks at the same time. Focus on the most vulnerable, be a translator of that need at that very micro level to donors and others, at the same time as we need to work with that next generation, those potential new hotspots that are already tangible and realistically so, and say, at least start by investing differently adaptation money and work with them in those places so that the curve in those places at least will become more shallow. And if I just give you in closing a figure that sort of highlights that a little bit. You know, the Central Emergency Response Fund, that main humanitarian sort of quick response fund, we've had for non-HRP, for non-humanitarian response plan countries, so countries we don't have an organized humanitarian, coordinated humanitarian presence, flash appeals, regional appeals, 85% of the money for climate-related disasters has over the last 12 or 18 months not gone into the most vulnerable, but has gone to countries that don't even have a humanitarian response plan yet, to those sort of evolving or new hotspots. So that's very real already. I'm just making a pitch. Let's not forget about these countries either.
And there's a whole separate conversation we could have about grants versus loans and this indebtedness argument. Tilly, let's come to you. If you could grab a negotiator for a coffee and talk about climate finance and being a humanitarian, what would you tell them?
I would strongly emphasize that the 100 billion is well below the trillions and trillions actually needed for adaptation, and then stress again that the longer that we're leaving any sort of substantial financial input, the more expensive it will be later on, and the more lives that the negotiators here are willing to lose in the time being. So yeah, that would really be the biggest part of this 100 billion is nothing in comparison to the actual needs, and that when governments do really recognize a crisis, they are willing to find the money. And so it would just be one of these statements again of please find the money now because we are in this crisis.
There's no time to wait.
Yeah.
Jill, hopefully you're still on the line with us. If you could talk to a climate negotiator, what would you talk to them about? What would you ask?
So I would show them, I wouldn't tell them, I would show them the cost of inaction by taking them on a time travel to the future to see the cost of that inaction, the cost of that motivating power to put their money where the talk is, because we've been hearing a lot of talk and it's now time for action because on the ground our communities are the ones that are being impacted. So I would take them on a journey through time to see the cost of their inaction in the future.
That is a fantastic point. Thank you, Jill. And Tiziana, what would you say to a climate negotiator in one of these corridors? What would you ask?
Can you hear me? Yes. Well, I don't want to be too pessimistic. Adaptation is exactly what we're talking about here, and this is what we want to reinforce. However, we all know that adaptation has limits. And so we need transformative solutions. We really need to, to move away from just coping with a difficult situation. We have enough of coping, that there's enough of that. And even just an incremental approach where we're keeping the system as it is, it's not going to work. At some point, adaptation will fail. We would not be able to adapt anymore. So yes, let's focus on adaptation now because we still have time to adapt. But we need transformative solutions. We need to innovate. We need to find other ways to deal with this crisis because adaptation has limits.
Thank you, Tiziana. So we're nearly at the end of our session. We will share some of our resources and we can tweet those out from the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance Twitter account. There's lots of reports, especially the ones that Tilly's been working on, the Spark reports and the At What Cost report. ODI have come out with some great reports recently, the Fair Share report talking about how much developed nations should be paying for adaptation and which ones are not, and the laggards in the crew. And we won't name and shame them now, but they know who they are. So we will share that with you. Can I just thank our panelists very much for joining us and having a great conversation. We will continue that informally. And just a call to everyone online to have a look at the Climate Charter, the Climate and Environment Charter. If you're with an organisation that hasn't signed up, it is well worth having a look. It really does muster your leadership around taking clear actions. And I think we all have had a good call to action tonight. So wishing everybody well in these last few days of COP. Good luck to our negotiators. The job couldn't be more serious. And thank you all for joining us. Good night.